What's up, gangsters? How about a little different kind of video? Okay, so let's be honest. This video is probably going to be pretty much the same in that it's going to be ridiculously long, ridiculously detailed, and maybe just ridiculous. And it's only going to matter to like 5 of you. But look, if you've followed any of my scale modeling content, you know that's just how I roll. You also know that I have a background in professional photography. Here's a 20-second presentation about that. Anyway, if you're into World War II aviation history, you build scale aircraft models, or you just love P-51 Mustangs, because who doesn't, right? You're probably familiar with this photograph right here and the controversy surrounding it. Specifically, you probably know that about a month after D-Day, the Allies ordered that all invasion stripes be removed from the upper surfaces of aircraft that had them, or that they be painted over. The Mustangs in this photo had them painted over, and the controversy is about exactly what color was used. Imagine that, scale modelers arguing about color. Who would have thought? I don't know that any World War II photo has had as many words written about it or has caused as many internet fistfights. And that was the case when it popped up recently in a Facebook group. And as I was reading the comments, I kept thinking that lots of the comments just didn't make sense, or that they were outright nonsense. Basically, in one corner you have Team Green, and they all believe that these aircraft were painted either in olive drab or some RAF dark green. Then in the other corner you have folks who believe it was blue. I think they might both be wrong, and in this video I aim to show why. But first, let's go to my own photo reference library and take a closer look at the photo itself, because it's actually pretty unique for several reasons. Okay, this is Adobe Lightroom, and it's a photo processing application that not only lets you quickly and easily edit images, but it's great for organizing them as well. I've got all 9,000 of my reference photos stored here, and I've used the collection feature to group some of my favorites together, including over 1,000 images of P-51 Mustangs. I even created a small collection of images just to help me talk about this photograph, which is known as the Bottisham Four. High-resolution digital images of World War II aircraft in flight and in color are rare, but that's just one of the things that makes this image special. Unlike most historic images, with this one we actually know a lot about the photograph itself and what's in it. The Bottisham Four was shot right before lunch on the 26th of July, 1944, using Kodachrome from a B-17 by a photographer named Ben Rosenblatt. Remember the part about it being Kodachrome, because that's going to come up again in a major way. We also know that these Mustangs were from the 361st group of the 375th Fighter Squadron, 8th Air Force, based at Bottisham Airfield, and that's why the photo is named that. On top of that, we also know who the pilots were that day, at least in the lead 2 aircraft, and they're the most important ones in this story. Let's zoom in here a little bit more. The aircraft in front, E-2 Charlie, was flown by 361st Group Commander Colonel Tom Christian. He and Lou 4, which was named after his wife, would unfortunately be lost several weeks later during a low-level bombing run in France. The second aircraft and its regular pilot were also lost in a training accident a few days before that. But on this particular summer day, that guy right there in the cockpit was a young pilot named Urban Drew from Detroit. Drew was a skilled flyer who flew 75 missions and would become an ace with 6 kills that included 2 German Me-262 jets. Mr. Drew would not only survive the war, but would go on to become an airline pilot and a significant character in this history mystery. Apparently, he had a pretty good memory. He even recalled details about who the photographer was and the fact that there were 2 photo shoots, one right before lunch and one right after lunch, and the type of film used in each shoot. Major Drew passed away in 2013 at the ripe old age of 89. The final thing that makes this photo unique is that it can be found in the National Archives. You can even bounce right over here to their website and search for it yourself. It's called K2487, and you can download a pretty large JPEG of this scanned print. But wait, there's more. The original 4x5 Kodachrome has been stored in the archives since World War II, and if you're dedicated enough, you can actually go there and they will take it out of the envelope so that you can get your own copy. I didn't do that, but I have my own copy of the digital scan of the original Kodachrome slide right here that was given to me. As you can see, this is an amazing image. It's a 200 megabyte TIFF file that's almost 12,000 pixels wide. You can practically zoom in on rivet heads without losing sharpness, and that makes it perfect for the kind of color analysis I had in mind when I started this project. However, there are some things that need to be considered about this photo before we get into any kind of death match between Team Green and Team Blue or any other team, before you can even really decide what team you want to be on. When you look at this photo, there are 2 things that are immediately obvious. It's underexposed and it has a bit of a blue cast. Underexposure is just one of those things that can happen. As a photographer, sometimes you just miss, and with film, you can't just fix it in post. In this case, however, there is one very good possible reason it happened, and that is the use of a polarizer. Polarizers are a very common type of lens filter, and some photographers even consider them an essential piece of gear. They've been around since the 1930s and were actually invented by Edwin Land, who also invented the Polaroid. Tiffin is a well-known filter manufacturer, and if we hop over here to their website, you can see a good description of exactly what they do. They make the sky bluer, they enhance clouds, and they eliminate reflections. They also improve contrast, and you can see that with the with and without photo right here on the website. How do they work? So, without getting into a bunch of nerdy details, you can think of these as sort of a bunch of microscopic Venetian blinds that only let light through from a certain angle. Have you ever tried to look into a pond and you can't see all the way to the bottom because there's glare reflecting off the surface of the water? So, what a polarizer does is it will eliminate that reflection by blocking light that's coming from the angle that causes that to happen. And like this one, you can rotate it to get it at the right orientation to do that. Now, where that helps you in other kinds of photography situations is that it cuts down on haze. Because what haze is a bunch of little water droplets floating around in the atmosphere, and that light reflecting off of it will often give a photo a washed out look. So when you use a polarizer, you get more color contrast and you get deeper blue in the skies. And that makes it perfect for, you guessed it, air-to-air photography. So it's very possible one was in use that day in July 1944, but there's no documentation I'm aware of to verify that. The reason I say it might be responsible for the photo being a bit dark is because they also suck up a little bit of light. And that requires a slight exposure compensation. It's possible, not throwing any shade on Mr. Rosenblatt and his photography skills, but he might simply have not accounted for that. Here's where we get to that blue color cast. Some people will say that's the proof a polarizer was used because, quote, polarizers make everything blue, unquote. You'll even see this pair of images floated around the internet, along with the claim that neutralizing the polarized version proves absolutely that the aircraft were one color or another. There are several things wrong with that claim. First, the photograph on the left isn't even the original, which you can see when I do a side-by-side comparison like this. More importantly, however, is the fact that polarizers simply do not turn everything blue, as hopefully you were able to see in the example photo from the Tiffin website. Another theory put forth to explain the blue cast is color film's alleged sensitivity to ultraviolet light at high altitudes. This fellow in particular is using big words and speaking very authoritatively about how this is quite common knowledge with photographers, and that, quote, all photographers expect a blue shift in photos taken at high altitudes. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that sounds good when you say it fast, but just doesn't hold up very well to scrutiny. First, most film has a UV protective layer on top of the emulsion for exactly this reason. There's no way to know if Kodachrome of the 1940s had such a protective layer, but it's a thing that undermines his entire argument. Secondly, a polarizing filter also blocks UV light. So, if one was used, as has been discussed, that would eliminate that particular possibility. Thirdly, as one astute observer pointed out, these aircraft aren't actually that high up, even though the deep blue skies certainly give it that feeling. Apparently, this particular type of cloud formation just doesn't exist above a certain relatively low altitude. And here's another photo that has a slight blue cast, and I feel certain this Mustang wasn't even as high up as the elevation at my house, which is around 1,500 meters. And here's yet another photograph shot by Ben Rosenblatt, possibly even on the same day and clearly at the same altitude, that does not have a blue cast. Finally, this theorist has used what's obviously not even a good copy of the original photo to make an argument that's based almost entirely on the, quote, colorless aluminum that shows a blue cast. With all of this sophisticated dissertation, he seems to have completely forgotten about the fact that aluminum would be reflecting the blue sky, as would all of the paint on the aircraft. And here's a couple of good example photos that show exactly that on the bare metal aluminum X24B. This is something that will come up again when we get into a more detailed analysis. Here's the more likely reason for the blue cast. It was intentionally added into Kodachrome for the simple fact that it's slide film and was designed to be projected onto a white surface with a slide projector. The blue cast was added in to balance out the yellow cast of the projector light. However, modern digital scanners lack that yellow light because they're daylight neutral, and so they don't have that color cast that old projectors had, and that can lead to a blue cast in the scanned image. Okay, now let's talk about the film, because I've mentioned several times that the fact this image was shot on Kodachrome is very important to the story. One of the most common and frankly laziest arguments against using this image to try and figure out what color those Mustangs were is that it's a faded old slide shot on sketchy color film from long ago. Yeah, unfortunately, this is simply a demonstration of rectal ventriloquism, also known as talking out of your ass. The fact is that Kodachrome is one of the best color films ever produced. Let's take a closer look. The modern version of Kodachrome film and the development process for it was actually developed by a pair of professional musicians, of all things. Leopold Godowski and Leopold Manez actually started working on it in 1917 when they were both in high school, and that work would continue when they went to Harvard. The fact that they were both musicians is pretty cool, given that Kodachrome actually had a very popular song written about it. Anyhow, it took them nearly 20 years to refine the process, but the film system was commercially introduced in 1935. The development process, which had to be done in a lab under controlled conditions, had some problems initially, but by the time World War II rolled around, it was all ironed out and Kodachrome was on its way to becoming the standard in color photography. That part about it requiring lab development is important, because while it was very controlled, Ektachrome, on the other hand, could be developed by the photographer in the field. So it was very possible for mistakes resulting in discoloration to occur. So if you're talking about an image like this one, for example, the crappy old film argument might hold water. But not with Kodachrome. It was definitely not dodgy, and it was not old film. By the time Kodak discontinued it in 2009, it had been manufactured for almost 75 years. Some of the greatest American color photographers of the late 20th century shot Kodachrome. Who could forget thumbing through the pages of National Geographic and looking at the stunning color work of artists like Steve McCurry and William Albert Allard? Let's just take a moment here, a small photographic interlude, to appreciate the work of two photography masters. And I'm sure you'll recognize this iconic image shot by McCurry in 1985. As an aside, I was actually lucky enough to go to one of his workshops back in the day. Not only was he a super nice guy, but he is so much of a badass that when Kodak produced the very last roll of Kodachrome, they gave it to him to shoot. There's even a documentary about it. As far as it being a faded old slide, yeah. Sorry, not sorry, but once again, you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. It's been calculated that yellow, which is actually the least stable pigment in the emulsion, would need something like 200 years to fade by 20% when the slide is stored properly. You know, like in an envelope at the National Archives. Now that we've looked at some general things about the image, let's dissect the positions of the green and the blue teams. How does Team Green define their position on the image, other than by simply acting like flat earthers and denying the photographic evidence? It seems to be based on 3 points, and I've even made some handy flashcards. The first thing is what they simply call logic. They believe that because virtually everything in the ETO that was American at that time was painted in olive drab, that there must have been thousands of gallons of it laying around, and therefore it was the most likely color. Like, dude, everything was painted green, so it was obviously green. Duh. Anyway, the fervence with which they defend this position is totally unimpeded by the fact that it's speculation based on extrapolation. The second point involves decades-old memories of eyewitness veterans or summoning their ghosts. When asked about it at Warbird events, Urban Drew not only insisted that they were green, but actually seemed a little offended at the idea that they were ever blue. It's a position that he maintained even through correspondence in his later life. Look, the problem is that eyewitness accounts are considered the most unreliable thing in the legal system for good reason. There's even an excellent documentary called My Cousin Vinny about this effect. Marissa Tomei and Joe Pesci do an excellent job of demonstrating how things people thought they saw weren't really what they saw. I highly recommend it. But it's also true that sometimes our brain just fills in the colors for us. If we know that something should be green, well, we're more likely to see it as green. In this photo, for example, we know that Mustang is obviously green. And we know that North American was painting brand new aircraft in dark olive drab. So even in this photo by time-lapse photographer Alfred T. Palmer, also shot on Kodachrome, even though those Mitchells in the background barely show any trace of olive drab, we know they were. And in this beautiful image we referred to already, it clearly shows that painting the tops of Mustangs green was a thing. So, at least that's plausible. Personally, I think there's some projection going on. Even in some of the very well-written analyses by members of the Blue Team, the authors insist that E2 Sierra in particular was absolutely painted green. Nonetheless, there's absolutely, and that's the only absolute, zero evidence or proof or documentation that any of the aircraft in this photo were ever painted green. And as we'll see, not much evidence in the photo either. Speaking of that analysis, now let's turn to the Blue Team's position. The head coach of the Blue Team was a gentleman named Dana Bell. Mr. Bell wrote a lot of things, including many books about aircraft colors, and he's practically considered a saint in the aircraft scale modeling community. Fair warning though, if you order some of his books, make sure you get the ones about USAF colors and not the ones titled Hour of the Wolf or Bare Necessities by a different Dana Bell. Unless you're into trashy romance novels, which is totally okay. The real Dana Bell, at least as far as this story is concerned, actually went to the archives and got a digital scan of the famous photograph. His 2018 analysis is more detailed, but the bottom line is he brought it into Photoshop, took a very close look at it, and concluded, holy shit, they really are blue. We'll take a closer look at exactly how he did that in a few minutes. His assistant coach is a guy named Mark Beckwith, who wrote a really nice analysis of his own in 2020. His basic position is that Saint Bell said so, and therefore it is. But, like all good assistant coaches, he expanded on the original plan. He also allowed for the possibility of surplus RAF paint stocks being available, and most importantly, he included some eyewitness testimony of his own. This is where we introduce Michael J. Bowyer. Bowyer was an Englishman who discovered at a very early age that he really loved plane spotting. To the point where, as a lad of 15, when he was cycling along the road next to Bottisham Airfield, he would stop, observe, and take written notes, including the day that he saw Mustangs that, as he put it, were resplendent in blue. He even got a friendly ground crewman to take him on a tour. It's a position that, as he says, has gotten him into a lot of trouble over the years. Here he is talking about it in 2003 on an interview with a British radio morning show.
And then, of course, at the end of 43, the metal runways were laid and the Thunderbolts came, 8th Air Force Thunderbolts. Thereafter, they were escorting American bombers, picking off German fighters. And in the summer of 44, they just received Mustangs. And I'm always in trouble for this, but if you cycle like I did along that side road to where the smokery is at Bottisham, the Mustangs were lined up, and to my amazement, lots of them had a beautiful blue top surface. It's like, I made models and what have you, and I drew these blue things quickly. And they had been painted blue, and people said, that's impossible. Even the group commander says, rubbish, but they were painted blue. And an American took me for a tour of these, so of course I did some more pocket writing with the serial numbers and what have you, and notes on them. And eventually it turned out that they hadn't enough camouflage paint to camouflage the silver Mustangs.
So why should we give his eyewitness testimony any more credibility than the other eyewitness testimony? Simple. He wrote it down. And he wrote a lot of books. Like a lot of books. Very detailed books. So he's not exactly the same as any other eyewitness. In fact, I would argue that he's actually more like an expert witness. Mr. Bowyer also wrote about blue Mustangs in a book called Mustang Memories, noting that there were, quote, among those, Bottisham Mustangs that had acquired a most superb blue upper deck into wings and fuselage, end quote. Even more specifically, he notes the serial numbers and squadron codes of several. Now this seems like good news for the blue team because one of those aircraft was E2 Hotel. And many observers of the famous photo have looked at it and thought, oh, that's that P-51B clear back there at the back. But before you blue team guys start hugging and high-fiving, here's the bad news. When you zoom in, you can see that the serial number is 2106811, which does not match the 2106900 Bowyer assigns to E2 Hotel in that passage. An even closer observation makes it clear why. There's a bar under the H on the aircraft in the photograph, which is something that was done in the 8th Air Force when there were two aircraft in the same squadron with the same squadron code. So, while we might use Bowyer's expert testimony as support for the idea that blue paint was actually a thing, it does nothing to prove that any of the ones in this photograph wore blue. But all hope is not lost, blue team guys. Here's another piece of the puzzle. If we're going to allow into evidence this photo of an aircraft that used green paint, and it was from an airfield near Bottisham, we should also allow these photos of P-47 Thunderbolts stationed at Boxted that pretty much everybody seems to agree were painted in dark and light blue. Boxted was also in the neighborhood, and it's not impossible to imagine that they were sharing ideas and materials. Before we move on, let's have a little fun and take a quick look at where the current state of this controversy is with green and blue Mustangs. Yikes! I think that last one just proves that having enough money to own and operate a Mustang still isn't going to buy you good taste. Okay, gangsters, so we've had a little bit of fun kind of going through some qualitative things about this famous photograph and talking about the arguments on both the blue and the green team sides. But if we're really going to solve this thing, we're going to have to go a little bit deeper. It's going to get more technical. So, if you need to go to the refrigerator and get a Red Bull or take a smoke break, now's the time. Some people have correctly argued that using this photo to actually decide the colors is problematic because it's a bit dark and it's got that blue color cast. But both of those things are relatively easy to get past. But before I do that, I need to show you a basic methodology for doing color correction on a digital image. And I'm going to do that by taking a couple of pictures of this model that I'm currently working on using my little Canon EOS R.
Okay, one of the things that is important to digital photography is getting your colors correct. Basically, in order to do that, you have to tell the little robots inside your digital camera what color is actually white. And you do that with the white balance setting, alright? And so we'll go to this menu real quick, and you'll see right there where it says white balance, and it's got a little sun symbol. What that means is basically that I've told the camera to use colors that correspond to daylight white balance. Alright, now if I want to, I can change that And now I have a bunch of different options. You can see I can have a shade white balance, cloudy day white balance, incandescent light white balance, fluorescent light white balance, flash white balance, or I can even set a custom white balance in temperatures, in degrees Kelvin. But let's just take a quick look at how it affects things, all right? And we'll use this Kodachrome 1/32 scale Spitfire that I'm working on as an example. Let's take a picture of it using daylight white balance. All right, so you can see what that photograph looks like. Looks pretty much like what you see right there. Now, let's see what happens if we change the white balance to something else. And we'll make a real drastic change. We'll change it over to fluorescent. And now you can see that it is very blue.
Looking at the two photos, you can clearly see that the one on the right definitely has a nasty greenish blue color cast. The little robots inside the camera had bad information about what was supposed to be pure white. Pretty much all photography applications give you a very simple tool for correcting that. In Lightroom, all we have to do is jump over here to the Develop menu and grab this little eyedropper tool and click on the area that should represent pure white. As you'll see, not only does that give us an image that's much better, but we'll be able to do that with any image that's in digital format. But first, let's take a look at a screen capture so I can show you that there's even more useful information available. This box that appears when I hover over the image shows the grid of pixels that's being sampled. Every pixel of every digital image is comprised of red, green, and blue light emitted by the display. When you look at the bottom of this box, you can see some numbers shown as percentages. Those pixels actually have values ranging from 0 to 256, and some photography apps show it that way, but Lightroom just uses percentages to keep it simple. You can think of these numbers down here as a sort of relative strength measurement. The important thing is that when you see all of those numbers are equal, you have a neutral color that isn't biased towards red, green, or blue. And that can be anything on the grayscale, all the way from pure white to pure black. As it happens, in Lightroom, the higher the number, the closer you are to white. So if these all said 100, 100, 100, that would be pure white. And if they said 0, 0, 0, that would be pure black. I know that some of you are immediately coming up with a couple arguments right now. One is, bro, there's only 256 colors. Unfortunately, that's just simply a misinterpretation. It's 256 cubed. It's the combination of all three values that creates the color, and with 256 values in each channel, that equals over 16 million possible combinations. The second argument is, bro, like you're talking like digital, bro, and this is like totally an analog image shot on slide film. There's no direct line from the pixels on your screen to the actual paint. Okay, that's actually a solid argument up to a point. If we take the extreme example of a black and white image, obviously I can measure the values of every gray tone displayed on my screen, and clearly that's not the way the thing was painted. And going back to bad color photos like this one, the argument still holds, but less. It's not like we're going to conclude that the color on the nose is anything other than yellow. When you're talking about a high quality scan of a Kodachrome, the argument is even less than that, even if it's a little bit dark and has a color cast that we keep talking about, because we're going to correct for that. Despite some of you guys insisting that this photograph cannot be used to determine what color those Mustangs were, some members of both the green and the blue teams are doing exactly that. Let's start with Team Green. Remember this thing down here? I've already stated that the image on the left isn't the actual image, but I also kind of take issue with the one on the right. Even though it's so-called neutralized, I personally think the image on the left is a more realistic representation of the sky. The truth is that color correction is a bit of an art, and it's totally dependent on how you sample the colors. The reality is that very few photographic tones in the grayscale are truly neutral. especially when they're getting a reflection from a huge blue sky overhead. It's also been said that this image pair was created by someone who used to work for Kodak and who used some kind of Kodachrome software. In 20 years of working with photography software, I've never heard of such a thing. I haven't used every software application out there, but I do have a lot of experience with photography software. And I'm also not saying anybody is being dishonest, but I think what we have is a case more of misunderstanding. What you can get are filters, presets, and add-ons for existing applications that will allow you to create the look of virtually any film ever made from a modern digital image. I actually use one called Alien Skin. I can take this photograph I shot of one of my own model airplanes and make it look like it was shot on Polaroid, or a black and white film like Ilford Delta 100, or yes, even Kodachrome. What's interesting to me is that when I use the Kodachrome preset, the change in the look of the original image is almost imperceptible. Make of that what you will. Anyhow, getting back to this pair of images, aside from anything else, they're just really low resolution and not actually good for much. So I use my own techniques to reproduce the image on the left, starting with the original scan. And this is what I came up with. Again, I can't speak for exactly what was done to this image to get to where it is from the original, but I will say that it took me a surprising amount of work to get there. But it doesn't really matter because what we're actually interested in is this one here on the right, given that many members of Team Green are adamant that it proves these aircraft were painted green. So let's take my version of the so-called polarized image and see if we can use the color correction technique I demonstrated a few minutes ago to neutralize it and get something similar to that one on the right-hand side so that we can take a closer look at it. Hopefully everyone can agree that my version on the left is a pretty good approximation of the with polarizing filter version in that two-shot comparison. Going back to the technique I showed you for color correcting a digital image, the natural thing to do is go and select one of these white invasion stripes that should be pure white. When I click there, this is the result we get. You can see there's really not much change. And that's not too much of a surprise, as you'll see when we go back and look at the color values in that white stripe. Note down there at the bottom at how close each of the three red, green, and blue values already are. So even though this image is allegedly the one that's got the blue cast from polarization, it's already pretty neutral. And it really doesn't change no matter which one of these white areas I select. The result is always about the same. So then I thought, well, black is also supposed to be neutral. So what if we color corrected off of that? And when you go and look at this black invasion stripe, you can see that even though it still is a little biased towards the blue, the values are also pretty close. But let's try it and see what happens. That's definitely a big change, but as you can see now the image has a very distinct yellow cast, which obviously we don't want. So I started thinking, okay, where are some other areas that should be color neutral? And I kept coming back to the idea that the aluminum really should be, but up here on top of the fuselage, it's picking up blues from the sky. But underneath the wing, it shouldn't be doing that, and we should have a pretty good place to sample. So look what happens when I grab right there on the bottom of that drop tank. And take note of the colors. It's still sort of biased towards the blue, but that right there is at least looking like a good possibility for something that comes close to the neutralized version. This isn't too bad. It's actually even more neutral than the neutralized version. And it's mostly in the skies, which we don't care so much about, but I think I might be able to do even better with a little bit of work. Okay, so I won't lie. I had to cheat. I went and did a few other things to it that are a little bit more advanced, and I'm not going to wear you out about that. Working on an image like that could be the subject of a video all its own. At any rate, this is about as close as I think I'm going to get to matching this image. So now let's throw up a comparison between my versions of the polarized and the neutralized version. So here we go. I think this again is a pretty good approximation of that comparison. So let's really zoom in on this image here on the right, and let's see if we can find any green. Okay, let's get our eyeballs primed by looking at some photos again of aircraft that we absolutely know are wearing green, and then let's come back to this photo that a bunch of the guys on green team insist beyond a shadow of a doubt proves that these aircraft were painted green. Let's get in there and take a closer look. How about at 100%? So I'm looking around and yeah, I just don't see it. But let's focus on E2 Sierra because it's the one that seems to be most often called absolutely green. And again, guys, I just don't see it. But let's take an even closer look. Let's zoom in to 400% and see what we see. Do you guys see green? I don't know. We know that these letters are black, and look at how close they are to this area around the cockpit. We know that this stripe was painted black, pure black should be, and look how close it is to the paint that's on the back of the fuselage. Now, going back to something that we've talked about already, the fact that the paint looks a little bit different in different areas. Okay, that goes back to it being a flat paint. Whatever color this is, I'll say it again, that's flat paint. It does not have the kind of specular highlights that would indicate it's a glossy paint. And so if it looks a little bit different from other things that are black, well, that's to be expected. Okay, so no luck seeing any green with my eyeball. Let's see if we can actually measure some, going back to this newfound superpower we have with the eyedropper of going around and measuring colors. So again, let's start with this area right here that again everybody insists is green. And look at those values. Look at how close they all are to 31. That's as much an indication of a very dark gray as anything. Let's bounce over here to this area on the fin fillet. Same thing. These values are all within about a point of each other. When you compare that to the black right there, look at how close those values are. And I think you'd have to agree that not only does it not look like there's any green, but it's not measuring any green. Let's zoom in even closer to this area at the wing root that a lot of people actually do believe was black and see what that says. There you go. Look how tight those three values are. They're within less than a point of each other. That again pretty much says dark gray. Let's bounce over here to the same area on Lu 4 because again, this is an area that a lot of people seem to agree is black. Grab the eyedropper. Look at that. Really, really tight. Again, within a point. And maybe slightly leaning to the blue. Let's take one final stab at it and go back here and look at E2 Alpha and see what it says. Again, look at how close those values are together. Maybe a slight bit of blue, which again can be expected from the blue in the sky. When you go down here, again, super close. So, you Team Green guys are not looking good. With absolutely nothing that even resembles any sort of proof, your position is looking super weak at this point. I hope you guys have picked up on a couple of things from what we've done so far. First, I hope you can see that color correction, as I've said, is definitely an art, and a lot of it just depends on how you sample your colors. And it's very sensitive to that process and can result in a lot of different looks for the same photograph, all of which look plausible. And that comes to the second point, which is I hope you guys are always questioning the provenance of the photos that you're presented with online, because they all look pretty good, but I guarantee you that whatever versions of this image you've been looking at, as you can see, there's a pretty good chance they look nothing like the original. Okay, let's take a look at the other side and see how the blue team bros are doing. We'll do the same thing we did with the green team, where we start with the original image and we do exactly what Dana Bell did in order to get something that we can take a closer look at. But this time it's going to be a lot simpler because, as he notes, all he did was lighten the original image and crop. I've made a copy and we'll start with lightening it. Of course, the question then becomes how much. About 1 stop seems appropriate, but again, this is entirely subjective. It's really according to what you think looks right, but anywhere between 1 stop and 1.5 stops seems pretty good to me. Okay, with that image lightened and cropped, now we've got something that we can compare directly to the screenshot of the slide from Dana Bell's article, and we can immediately see there's a little bit of a difference in the color tone. And this is why I said that I sort of suspected that maybe there was a little more going on with Dana Bell's image than just the aforementioned lightening and cropping. It's important to note here that there are different ways of lightening an image. All I did was go over here and increase the exposure. But there are other ways, and obviously I have no way of knowing what Dana Bell's technique was or what his Photoshop skills were like. But let's take a closer look at this one real quick. When you zoom in, I think it's pretty easy to see why he thought there was some blue here. I can see it with my eyeballs. I don't see it on this one, and it's much harder to see on these two in the back. But let's go back to our superpower and see what it looks like with the color picker. When we get into that area right there, you can clearly see a blue cast. When we slide over here to the insignia, which we know were dark blue, that's exactly what they show. If we jump down here to the invasion stripe, you can see kind of what we saw before. They're black with that slight blue cast that we would expect. Jumping back down to this one, same sort of thing. Kind of black with that blue cast. Okay, so I went off and did some work, more than I expected to have to, honestly. And here's my version of the image that's in Dana Bell's analysis. So let's take a closer look at that one. So here we go. This isn't perfect, but I think it's close enough. If we zoom in, I think you can still see why Dana Bell thought that he saw some blue tones there. Let's just take a few quick measurements again. And there we go. A very distinct blue cast. Down here on this, yeah, not so much. And what you definitely don't see there is anything biased towards green. I mention that because this is the part of Dana Bell's analysis that truly baffles me. He very specifically says that he thinks the top of E2 Sierra was green and that the tones on the tail of E2 Charlie were a, quote, good match for that. And not only can I not see it with my eyeballs, but when we go over there with the color picker, there is literally no reason whatsoever to believe that that was green. Look at the green value down at the bottom. It's absolutely the lowest. Once again, what we have there is something that appears to be a slightly bluish black. And that right there is why I said at the very beginning of this video that I think maybe both Team Green and Team Blue might be wrong. When I took a look at the Bottisham Four, the first thing I said to myself was, dude, those things are black. And when I said it out loud, I definitely got a lot of hate for it. Like a lot of hate. Some simply accused me of spreading misinformation, but others were so outraged you would have thought that I had suggested their mothers were having sexy fun time with goats. This charming fellow came right out and called me a bell end, which I guess is British for dickhead. This one who posted the polarized versus non-polarized comparison we've talked so much about is actually the moderator of one of these Facebook groups, and he straight up blocked me just for asking questions and trying to have a conversation. The comments literally ran into the hundreds, and I responded to almost all of them. One super dedicated guy who actually has a YouTube channel that is allegedly all about historical accuracy left an LOL emoji reaction on literally every one of my responses. He made fun of me for having a physical handicap, being single, and apparently having no family. But way worse than that, wait for it, he said that my own 1/72nd scale Mustang that I built last year was full of, quote, blatant errors. It was clearly a clumsy effort to undermine my confidence and my credibility, but yeah, that didn't work. I sent that model to the Netherlands for Scale Model Challenge last year, and it actually won a gold medal. In all honesty, it became a kind of a social experiment for me. The Team Green dudes were by far the most upset. Their reactions ranged from smart guys I'm well acquainted with who simply said, dude, it just feels like they're supposed to be green, to moon landing denier levels of abusive cognitive dissonance. This dude was one of my favorites. He's absolutely certain from this quote photo that they were green. But he probably should have looked a little closer and he would have seen the name of the person who painted it down in the lower right hand corner. The so-called logic and certainty used in some of these denials make it really clear that the real pandemic is Dunning-Kruger syndrome. The scale modeling community in general can be pretty toxic, and especially with model airplane builders. Some of these guys have already got well-established reputations for being pretentious clowns, so no surprise. But it was still pretty astonishing. It makes you wonder how they handle situations that are actually important. It seems like a lot of these guys just really need it to be green, like they're emotionally invested. And the very idea of it being anything like black-ish or very dark blue wasn't just nonsense, it was as offensive to them as the idea of it being blue was to Urban Drew. But what's weird and honestly more than a little silly about that is that the same guys are totally okay with Thunderbolts from just down the road at Boxstead being black, or so dark blue as to appear black. It's even been suggested that the dark color on those Thunderbolts was RAF Night, which is black mixed with ultramarine pigment, and which seems to perfectly describe the color we see in the photo of the Bottisham Four. And look, it's not like it's the only photo that shows Mustangs wearing some kind of very dark paint. That a lot of these guys also insist is green, but which certainly does not show up in the photographs. This Mustang right here, for example, fits that description perfectly, and so does this one over here. Then there's this photo of Tika 4 that clearly has some kind of very dark blue-green clear out there on the wingtip. Look, no matter how hard they want to deny it, green not only isn't the only option, but it's actually the least likely option. And there it is. I warned you guys up front that this thing was going to be long, stupid, and a little bit different. If it seems like it was scripted, yeah, you're not wrong. I actually tried to do this thing using my usual lazy YouTube technique of just winging it, and it was an absolute fail. Not just because it was a total mess, but because it was like an hour and 40 minutes long. So I trashed the whole thing, started over, and as bad as this is, you should have seen version 1.0. It took me something like 25 pages of script and over 50 video clips. So if you're tired of it, imagine how I feel. So let's wrap it up so we can all move on with stuff that actually matters in life. Let's summarize. We've got 3 options that are all honestly a bit imperfect at this point, but not equally imperfect. The team green option can be summarized as follows. Weak sauce. Nothing more than supposition about what color they should have been, sketchy eyewitness reports, and absolutely no documentation whatsoever, and literally zero photographic evidence. Sorry, Team Green guys, but y'all are fail. The boys in blue actually look a lot better. They at least have a little bit of photographic evidence and a written report by at least one expert witness, as well as the precedent of a similar situation at a nearby airfield. The third team that I'm forming, and we're going to call the All Blacks because that just sounds cool and black is cool, actually has the most photographic evidence and that same situation with the Thunderbolts down the road. I'm not planning on building a model of any one of the Bottisham Four anytime soon, although if Edward is actually coming out with that 1/32nd scale B/C Mustang that they say is coming next year, I don't know, I might be tempted. But look, if I do it, people have asked me, okay, what color are you going to paint it? And the truth is, I'll be going with the blue-black option if I do it. Not only do I think that's actually the best answer, but I just think it would look dope. And it's honestly going to enrage some people. But look, every one of these options has weaknesses. And if you prefer green or blue, nobody can tell you that you're absolutely wrong. As I've said before, the only people who are absolutely wrong about what color those Mustangs were are the people who are certain about what color those Mustangs were. At any rate, as much fun as it was to go down this rabbit hole, I'm ready to be done with it and get back to some actual fun stuff. It was an interesting journey and I learned a lot, so I hope you guys did too. And as always, if you've stuck it out this long, I appreciate it and much love.